Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie, and today, at a viewer's request, I'm going to recommend another book that helps with historical European martial arts, because basically some people don't have access to clubs, or want extra resources to study, and just generally want to get better at sword fighting with the aid of books. So, which book am I recommending this time? I'm recommending In St. George's Name. Now, despite the obvious connotation of the title, which, for those who don't know, St. George is sort of like the patron saint of England. So you're thinking British or English. But the hilarious part of this is, despite the fact that it's titled In St. George's Name, and it's got that sort of connotation of, you know, English martial arts and things, it is actually, as it says underneath, an anthology of medieval German fighting arts. And actually, I think even that's kind of... I'm trying to remember which exact sources are covered in this, because I have read it, but I can't remember where the origins are, because I'm not that great with German fencing. But I think it does cover some Renaissance stuff, and not just medieval stuff, but that's nitpicking. In terms of the general content, it's got plenty of stuff on longsword, arming sword. In fact, let me just have a look at the contents, make sure I get all of it remembered. Yeah, so it's got dagger. It has got a few bits about the various masters, who was before whom. Wrestling, I've forgotten about that. Longsword. It does mention some information about things like mounted combat, armoured combat, sword and buckler combat. So it has a few things, and one of the excellent things as well is it has pictures. Now, I don't know if you're anyone like me, but you probably can't read through an essay and not fall asleep. So having brief descriptions on what's supposed to be happening, and while you're thinking, how do they mean? You see the pictures, and you can just immediately notice what's going on. Like, let me see if I can see a quick version. Yeah, so here's one that's pretty easy to demonstrate. This is one from the Pollax section, Fighting in Armour, and let me check that you can see it all properly. Yep. So there's the first picture, which shows that they start in their positions, sort of what they call Vom-Tag, or basically higher guard, in this case on the shoulders. Then they engage and bind, and then the third part, after they finished binding, is the winner, the victor, has wound around and has shown the point of his poleaxe to the opponent. So that just summarises it, and obviously it goes into the detail. It's got sort of a paragraph or two which explains, you know, the context of when and where this might happen. We'll mention, you know, person Rob left and Christian right, each form guard Vom-Tags. That's what we've got up here. So here you can see, obviously, they're starting in this. This is called Vom-Tag, and same on this side. And then they've delivered an Oberhowl, which is, I keep calling it a fendente, because that's what they call it in Italian. But you've got like that sort of strike, or even that sort of strike, what I did in the beginning, actually. And then, of course, they bind. And then, final action, they wind. Wind and bind. That's a very German sort of thing to do. Binding and winding. Winding and binding forever. So that starts to show you the sort of thing that it does. So it has areas which go into, you know, more detail. We've got these sorts of pages that talk about the various... I'm not going to show it too close. I don't want to accidentally basically give the whole book, and you can just pause and read every page. But it's got sections that are more, you know, go into the nitty-gritty with the text, so you can further understand, you know, the weapons themselves, what their purpose is, you know, beyond the obvious, like, oh, I've got a spear, it stabs, ha ha ha. You know, more information about when it's best to use, what sort of, perhaps, you know, type of troop might use them, again, you know, beyond the obvious sorts of things. And also, other information I can't remember if it was just in the Flower of Battle one, another book that I will be recommending that talks about Fiore and Italian stuff, but there was one, possibly this one as well, that talked about when certain techniques are better in armour, better out of armour, extra information like that. So it doesn't just show you, so this is the technique, now try it out. It will tell you, okay, so this sort of thing works better if you've got decent armour, this sort of thing is best against unarmoured targets, you know, those sorts of things. So it's got the sections of pictures, the nitty-gritty text sections, and of course it's handily turned into sections. So you've got sections, as you'll see, I'll give it a distance shot. You've got sword and buckler, and you've got stuff like dagger, and if they've dressed up in the sort of medieval garb, and they've got pretty decent quality sort of replica weapons and gear, so you can really get into the idea and that medieval mindset. And it is apparently by this person here, Christian Henry Tobler. I think it was someone else. Yeah, Christian Henry Tobler. I don't know of him personally, so I can't say, how accredited he is and stuff like that. But what I know is, in terms of the actual content inside the book, I'm quite satisfied. I was able to read it, and sometimes I've looked at certain entries in books, especially the original treatises and their translations, and I'm sat there thinking, this doesn't really make that much sense. You might have a vague picture or something that doesn't really properly explain how that sort of thing is done. Whereas with these sorts of books by I think it's from the Freelance Press. Yes, it is. You can tell these markings here mean it's from the Freelance Press, who basically, whoops, you did not see that, will actually show that they are, books that there are quite a few Freelance Press books on this sort of medieval Renaissance fighting, and I've found them quite good. I'll, of course, mention others in other videos, but like I said, with this particular book, I have found that its descriptions and explanations of the techniques are very clear and concise, and where the text might not explain what on earth is going on, especially if you're not familiar with the German terms like a Vormittag or an Oberhau, Unterhau, Mittelhau, Schielhau, Zornhau, a lot of how. You wonder how on earth they get away with it, but anyway, then you can actually get a clear sort of picture or something, so it actually represents what's supposed to be happening. Now, it's always worth bearing in mind when you read these books, there will be sometimes variations on how you can do exactly the same thing. It's like, let me think of an example. Sometimes you can have... I'm struggling to think of an explanation how to explain it, but sometimes, you basically, when you read these books, it's worth bearing in mind that, first you can take it with a bit of salt, pinch of salt in terms of, not everything will be absolutely perfect, but mainly it's worth bearing in mind that people will fight in different ways. So, try not to look at these sorts of books and replicate everything perfectly, because you might find that you end up, for example, a shorter person like me might actually have their points sort of higher, and there'll be different positions and different sort of mechanics in the footwork and the rest that you might find between people. So sometimes you might see it recommending something like a passing step forwards, whereas maybe you actually do better, going a bit diagonally when you're going forward. So sticking roughly to what it tells you to do, but not so strictly that you look at the photograph and go, okay, it's sort of this high, and he's got a point about here, yeah, and foot, no, a bit further, no, millimetre, yep, okay, yeah, here we go. Because it's not realistic, it needs to be fluid. But in terms of, as long as you bear that in mind, that you're going to need to experiment with these techniques. You can't just read the book and then have the techniques. You actually need to put them into practice, find a good sparring partner, and it's also worth putting it under pressure, because there will be different circumstances where, you sort of, experience, perhaps against certain opponents, certain techniques don't work, and it's just the way things are and worth bearing in mind. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm starting to digress from the actual book itself, but like I said, I'm very happy with the content. I mean, I prefer colour pictures over black and white, but that's really just nitpicking at that point. The actual content itself is really clear and concise, it makes sense. I have learnt from it and found it very interesting, especially in diversifying into the sorts of things that I know a lot less about, such as poleaxe. Those sorts of things I haven't really had much chance to practice, and trying to get an understanding and reading it not in those manuscripts that are roughly translated and are very difficult to understand, instead having it in modern English in a format that people will understand, acts as a bridge between you, the modern person who sits in an office or on the computer all day, and those medieval people hundreds of years ago who know their thing. It sort of bridges the gap in between. And I think these sorts of books, and the ones I'm also going to refer to in other reviews, do it very well. So you haven't lost the meaning of it. You know, it's not like it's bastardized the information into something that's not really medieval anymore, but at the same time it's been translated in an understandable format to the modern man such as myself. So in a way it's done that really well, because you can end up on one side or the other of the spectrum accidentally, and I've found it a nice sort of balance in there. So that's In St. George's Name. In terms of teaching techniques, I mean, obviously you've got the books to teach you techniques, but if I can get myself a sparring partner, or someone who's sort of willing to go through lessons on camera, then I can teach you those sorts of things more specifically, which will very well be based on books like this as well, not just what I've experienced in training and what coaches have taught me. So that's that for today. I hope you enjoyed this and have learnt something, or at least learnt of a place where you can learn. And see you later. Last thing, if you really have watched this video all the way through, I realise I'm making a habit of this, but if you could comment somewhere, even just try to be more subtle this time, just include the number 57 in your comment, then I'll know you've watched the whole thing. Cheers.